So, hello everybody, and thank you for joining Page Executive's ENABL series on creating your NED brand. And this is our second conversation in the series, and today I'm joined by Cedi Frederick, a chair at the NHS Kent Medway. So, Cedi, would you mind introducing yourself to our viewers?
Joanna, pleasure to be here. Yes, indeed. I'm Cedi Frederick, and as you say, I chair NHS Kent Medway. I've had a 45 plus year career in the public and not-for-profit sectors around housing and social care. And in parallel, I've had a multi-year non-executive director career, which no doubt we'll talk about in more detail as we go through. Just by way of context, because this may also become part of our discussion, I stopped full-time work in 2015.
Wow. Okay.
And that may come into the discussion at some point. So that's who I am. Delighted to be here.
Thank you so much. So the challenge of many of our members listening is getting that first NED position. So can you give us some insight to how did you get your first NED role?
Well, that was in 1990.
Oh.
So that may well be before many of the people participating in this event were actually born, or they might well still have been at school. But at that time, I worked for a local authority housing department, and it was clear following changes in government legislation that the local authority aspect of the housing provision was going to be transferred to housing associations. I'd already had a 12-year career in local government, working in the housing department, but knew very little about housing associations. So what motivated me to apply for my first NED role was as a way of learning about the housing association sector. So initially, I applied for a non-exec director role in a small South London housing association who were looking for board members. I applied. In those days, it was all by letter and so on and so forth. And to be frank, I was pretty surprised that I was invited to join the board after a process.
It's interesting that you say that. So it seemed as if you were using the skills that you'd already gained in order to help elevate you into that role by staying within that sector. Is that something that you would advise people to look at and think and consider about?
I would, because it was clear from the information that was shared with me by that housing association, they were looking to strengthen their housing knowledge around the board table. It was a community-led housing association, so many of the members of the board were from the community, but they didn't have that detailed housing knowledge. So I came in as a bit of a subject matter expert in terms of housing, but also someone who, because of my history and so on, I was able to demonstrate that I understood their values and their culture being community-led. So it was a win-win situation. And I always think that when you go into your first role, you can offer not just your subject matter expertise, but your lived experience, which I think is really, really important.
Right. So your career as a NED has spanned, I suppose, 30 plus years. What motivates you to keep adding to your portfolio of NED positions?
My fundamental motivation hasn't changed.
Okay.
And I guess it overlaps with how I see the work that I've done as a professional.
Okay.
And that is always to make a difference. Do I believe fundamentally and deeply, which I think will play into how I approach an application or whatever, do I really believe that I can add value to that organization and make a difference to that organization and the work that they do, be that in the not-for-profit space, be that in the education world, be that in the private sector, and so on and so forth. And I think if you're able to truly understand the difference that you believe you can make, I think you can build everything from that. So I think it takes an awful lot of thought before you apply.
So what's too much? Because you're balancing, if you think about those early days, you would have had a full-time role, your first NED role, or maybe a few years in now, and now you're at the stage where you're doing a portfolio role. What's good practice? How many is enough? Or can you not do it like that? Is it worth saying, I'll only do 4, or I've got to be of a certain level in order to take on my first NED role because of the balancing act of how to, cope with the day job and this. Can you give us any insight to around how people do that?
I think it starts with your motivation. If I go back to my very first non-exec director role on the board of that small housing association.
Yeah.
So just to put it in geographical context, at that time I was working for a North London housing association. My family home is in Hertfordshire. So I made the decision, really importantly, with the support of my wife, that at the end of a long working day, this was pre-congestion charging, I would drive through London, across one of the bridges, I think it might have been Vauxhall Bridge, to a housing association in South London that held their board meetings in the evening. I would then, at the end of a long board meeting, at around 9:30, if sometimes later, I would then drive back from South London all the way through London to my family home in Hertfordshire. And that was a conscious decision that I made. I explained the rationale to my wife. She was very supportive. Our 2 young children at the time didn't have much say in the matter. But I think it starts out with your commitment. Do you really want to do it? Are you prepared to not just put in the intellectual work, but the hard work it will take, especially if you are in full-time employment? Increasingly, board meetings are held during the day, so you'll need the support of your employer. But it may well be, if you start out small, with a small charity or a not-for-profit organisation or whatever it may be, those meetings may be held in the evening because many board members will have full-time jobs.
Yeah. And is it something then that you should share with your employer and go, right, I have taken on this extra commitment? How is that received? Is there a feeling that they, do they look and go, oh, who's going to do your job, or how much time are you going to lose doing your role? What do you advise our listeners to do?
I would absolutely share that with your employer. As we know, many employers these days want their senior members of staff to offer their time outside of work. Many companies or organizations will actually give you time off to fulfill those roles. Okay. What it also does is it demonstrates to your organization, to your company, that you have that level of commitment, but also it demonstrates that you are putting yourself in a place of learning and development, especially around the board table, because irrespective of the size of the organization that you sit on the board of, those responsibilities as a non-executive director in whatever sector come with an awful lot of legal and other responsibilities. Yeah. So it really does demonstrate to colleagues and your organization that you have that level of commitment to add value to different sectors and your own organization.
Brilliant. Thank you. So in your role as chair for the Integrated Care Board for Kent Medway, what are you actually looking to see from that first-time NED who's interviewing with you?
Well, I guess it starts from the submission of the CV. All too often what I see are candidates who have topped and tailed their professional CVs and submitted that as part of their application. I think it requires a very, very, very different approach. So if I go back, which I did recently actually, because I keep all of my applications in a folder on my system. And I think it's fair to say that initially I made a number of fundamental mistakes in how I prepared to apply. And what I saw as I looked at applications was I became more sophisticated as I went through. And what I mean by that was the challenge is to turn all of your professional experience into added value.
Yeah.
I also think many applications or applicants, forgive me, are worried about sharing their own lived experience. So they won't share in their CV what they have learnt, the lessons they've learnt as through life. And that's interesting now, because when you think about the increasing focus on diversity around board tables, in particular, not just racial and gender, but cognitive diversity, that personal lived experience really strengthens an application. So I look for someone who sees their role as adding value, does not see their role as shadowing the executive experience that's already around that board table, but also recognizes, and this is not just in the NHS or in the not-for-profit sector, but equally, increasingly in the private sector.
Yeah.
It is about, in the same way that we talk about people bringing their whole selves to work, I think it's about bringing their whole selves to the board.
Yeah, I think that's really well put, actually. And I suppose there's that reluctance too, because you don't want people to know your development areas, do you, or the challenges that you may have in your work. So I suppose that hiding, but that transparency you're saying could actually elevate you in that application process. So that's interesting. And I hadn't thought of that. I hadn't thought of that at all.
Absolutely. So when we have a vacancy, and I'm speaking here not just as chair of NHS Kent Medway, but previously I chaired a hospital trust board in London. All too often, candidates will ask to speak to me informally as part of their preparation to apply for the role. When I meet the candidate for the first time, one of the icebreakers that I use to start the conversation is to invite the people I meet to tell me their story. All too often, they'll start with what they currently do in terms of the day job, the organisation they work for, their qualifications, and I will stop them and politely say, no, tell me your story.
Yeah.
Don't start at primary school, but, who are you? What's been your journey to get to the point that you want to apply to become a non-exec director on an NHS trust board, for example, or another board that I've chaired in the past, and so on.
Yeah. Thank you. I really like that. And I think people will appreciate that. Is it still acceptable, though, to have that conversation before the official interview, that, our chair's expecting us to call them and go, hi, I'm going to apply. Can we have a chat? Is that still good etiquette?
I think it's fair for me, yes, it is. Certainly, when we are using recruitment consultants like yours and others to help us recruit, when I have the briefing conversation with the lead partner or whoever, I will purposely say to them, any applicant who wishes to speak to me, please encourage them to do so. Now, I know that some chairs, because of pressure of time, will only invite those candidates who've been shortlisted to have a conversation.
Yeah.
My view is I want someone at the application stage to really get a sense of, actually, is this worth my time applying?
Yeah.
Even at that stage, because it takes time, especially if you go back to first principles with putting your CV together and your application together. And I would strongly suggest that every application you should start from the beginning. You should just not find and replace. You should not just copy and paste. I think that's the worst thing you can do. I want them to get a sense from me as to actually, from what I've heard from the chair, as opposed to what I've read on the website or the annual report or, you know, the Glassdoor reference or whatever that company is, from what I've heard, I really want to apply for this. Or actually, I'm not sure it's a really good fit, so I'm not going to take my Sunday afternoon to put my CV in, prepare my CV and put it in.
Yeah. But
every chair does it differently. So it's probably not for me to say in absolute, this is the way it should be done.
No, I appreciate it, but it is, you know, from a sector fit standpoint, I know that public sector have never minded doing that. So it's just a note to let people know. So as a Black man, having sat on boards for nearly 4 decades, what are the key things upon reflection that you would have done differently regarding your board career? Now, I know that you've touched on that a little bit by saying, you know, if you look at your applications, there was some tweaking there. But is there anything else that you could share with us?
Oh my gosh. That really is a great question. I think there's deep parallels to my growth as a non-executive director, as a executive director in my professional role, or roles, forgive me. And that is about having the self-confidence to be myself. I think it's fair to say that in my early state, I mean, others may disagree, people who have known me on my journey may disagree, because I've always been, you know, fairly opinionated and willing to share my thoughts and views. But I certainly held back that sense of, this is who I am. And I think I felt on many occasions I had to resist the temptation to challenge in ways that might well have been felt to be uncomfortable by others. If we go back to 1990, I think it's fair to say that the quality of the discussions around board tables and in organisations around diversity was not as well established and accepted as they are today.
Yeah.
So raising issues around inequality, for example, around representation, around board tables at that time, certainly was not an area that I really pushed. Yeah. I think it's fair to say, as I became more confident and more well established, I felt much more comfortable about bringing that aspect of my lived experience into the conversation. So, and clearly the increasing emphasis being seen in organisations, quite rightly, public and private, around equality, diversity and inclusion has made those conversations a little easier. And now, because I do spend time mentoring next generation non-exec directors, especially from ethnic minority communities, I encourage people I speak to be confident in raising issues.
Yeah.
There's also this sense of imposter syndrome that you carry, whether or not you've been appointed to a role because of your gender, because of your colour, and not because of what you know and what you bring and so on and so forth, and the value that you can add. So I think it's about, this is where the role of the chair, I think, is really important, to support and encourage new Black non-exec directors, Black and brown non-executive directors, to really step into that space from the start.
Yeah, I like that. And I think you're right, it's that confidence, isn't it? Because there's no point then getting on around that table and then not adding any value to that conversation and those decisions being made. So I think when I've interviewed non-execs who are either Black or Asian or brown, it seems to come through a lot that we sort of adjust ourselves because we're not that confident, and we've got to have that self-belief back if we're going to make that impact. So I'm glad you touched on that. I really am pleased.
Yeah.
I often suggest to executives who are from the private sector that they look at their first NED role being in the public sector. Do you actually think that's good advice? And if so, why? Why would you agree with me on that?
I think it's great advice. I think absolutely spot on. And I think the reason being primarily because organizations in the public / not-for-profit sector, whilst there is a view that they are not businesses, increasingly they have to be more business-like.
Yeah.
So a classic discussion point in the NHS is around finance and living within your means.
Yeah.
Now, there's a challenge in the NHS, of course, because what we have to do is meet what is an increasing demand and often an unknown demand. So it's very difficult to be precise and absolute when it comes to budgeting and spend and so on and so forth. However, where NEDs from the private sector can play a really important role is to really get boards to think about outcomes, performance, those business metrics that drive the private sector. Now, there are many who will be part of this call who will say, hang on a minute, we do that anyway. I'm not suggesting that we don't, but that needs to be an ongoing discussion, especially at a time and what we can see in the future where resources are going to get tougher and tougher.
Yeah.
And I think the private sector have much more experience of making those really, really difficult and tough decisions, which I think increasingly the public sector are going to have to make.
Yeah.
So I think there's an awful lot of value that can be brought into that not-for-profit public sector space by applicants from the private sector.
Right. Thank you for backing me up on that. So could you shed some light, because I now want to sell it to them. Can you shed some light on the average salary for a NED and the typical length of tenure and the time commitment within the NHS?
Well, of course, it's across a spectrum.
Yeah.
If you start at one end, the charitable sector still do not pay their trustees.
Yeah.
So you start off with zero. Yes, you may well be able to claim expenses, but in terms of getting paid for your time, et cetera, it doesn't work in that charitable spiel. It goes through different aspects. So, for example, if you are on the board of a housing association, it may well be £12,000, £13,000 a year. And similar with the NHS as non-exec director. If you are a non-executive director of a foundation NHS trust, there's more flexibility. And of course, you may well get slightly more if you are chairing, in particular, the audit committee, because there's a real lack of audit committee applicants and so on and so forth. If you go into the private sector, again, it may well be 30 to 40,000 a year. I've heard of many private organizations paying more than that. In terms of time, I think the general rule of thumb is it'll always be more time than advertised.
Yeah.
So where you see, for example, in the NHS, 2, maybe 3 days a month, I have to tell people it'll be more than that. When you're talking about board meetings, all too often you're asked to sit on a committee, you have board papers to read, workshops. Increasingly, you're asked to undertake online training, and sometimes in-person training, maybe about safeguarding or fraud or anti-fraud or whatever. So please, any applicant, take that time commitment with a slight pinch of salt. But I would really say it's worth it. It's absolutely worth it.
So are you thinking, when we're taking it with a pinch of salt, around what, doubling that time? So let's say it says 9 hours, or you know.
As a rule of thumb, I'd probably say yes.
Yeah.
Now, clearly, you can go into a situation where you make it absolutely clear that you only have 2 days a month. That's all you can give. And then it's for the chair or the board to make a decision. Actually, is your value, the value you bring to that board, are they okay to work with your time limitation? So I'd always say it's a conversation to have.
Right. Thank you. So do you have any practical tips on how to make our members' CVs stand out when they're applying for their NED positions? Is there anything that you've seen on CVs and you've gone, that's a good idea? Or is there something that you're longing to see but you never do get to see as a chair on there and you think that's a bit disappointing?
As I mentioned earlier, I'd always say start from first principles.
Mm-hmm.
I think you owe it to the organisation that you're applying to join the board of to do more than just cut and paste.
Yeah.
I think what I don't see enough of is the difference that applicants have made. What I do see is an awful lot of inputs. I was on this working group, I was on this task and finish group, as opposed to the difference I made was X, Y, or Z.
Yeah.
I also don't see enough evidence of people's willingness to challenge, because I do think part of being a dynamic, high-performing board, and it's a challenge for the chair to manage, is that to invite challenge from around the board table.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you may defer to subject matter experts. So you may not be a finance expert, so you'll perhaps allow the NED, who is a finance expert, to lead the response to a paper. But I'm sure if, through your own experience, you'll have contributions to make. So I think it's about how you will, bearing in mind the collective responsibility of the board for not just performance in people terms, but financial performance. So those areas where you're not a subject matter expert, what contribution will you bring to those conversations? I don't like spectators around my board table. I want to be challenged in terms of my ability to manage the time that we have around the board table together to ensure everyone has an opportunity to contribute.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not about saying, this item is on finance, so only person A or B can contribute, because we are a unitary board, so we are collectively responsible. Now, I know as a non-executive director, especially in the private sector, having joined the board of my first listed company about a year ago, I had a really steep learning curve in terms of the expectations of the board of a listed company. So my contributions in some respects are not as helpful as those people with many years experience. But nevertheless, I challenge myself to add value where I can throughout all of our discussions.
I think it's great. I mean, that's the thing that I'm really conscious that sometimes we can go into ourselves. And I think hearing it from you is quite important. And I'm hoping that all the listeners do go, yeah, I've got to do that, and be brave around that piece. So my final question to you then is around the future of boards. We know they're changing, but what do you feel they will look like? We know AI will play a part, but, generally, are you going to see more younger individuals on there who haven't, not at the latter stages of their careers? What are you seeing already within the NHS? And what are you talking about which is lacking and needed for that future?
I think there's some things that are not going to change.
Yeah.
I think it's always going to be more challenging for younger professionals who have families and jobs, for them to balance perhaps their professional career aspirations, where they've got to give time to their work and their family, as well as a non-executive director role. I do think that boards are going to need to become much more collaborative. And I do think there's going to need to be a greater, not separation, but clearer water, so to speak, between the role of the executive and the non-executive. I think we've seen across multiple sectors what can happen when the non-executives perhaps get a little too close to the executive and start to mark their own homework effectively, and they lose that sense of independence. I think the level of scrutiny, especially when you're talking about risk and risk appetite, I think is really, really important. And it's very easy over time for non-executives to be drawn into that quasi-executive space and not bring that level of external, objective rigor to a discussion. So I think that's going to be not a big change, but I think it's something that we need to keep an eye on.
Yeah.
I'd like to think that we will see more younger applicants. I think it could be a challenge for the reasons that I've said.
Yeah.
Equally, what we're also seeing, of course, is at the other end, more and more, forgive the use of the word, older professionals making the decision to establish portfolio careers when perhaps previously, pre-pandemic, they might have thought about working to their mid-60s. Now I think there's a very different perspective. I don't think we should underestimate how competitive these markets are becoming. I go back to my early experiences. There were very few processes that are as rigorous as they are today. So I don't want to put a negative in terms of my perspective there. I think the role of the non-exec director will become increasingly important across the private and public sectors. And by public sector, I mean here the charitable sector, the housing association world, and so on.
No, and I think we would tend to agree with you on that. I mean, we're now in a situation, I think, is that the top 100 companies all have female representation on them, which is great. And it would be great to see in the future that we see that from ethnicity going forward. But you're right. I think if we're really about getting that diversity of thought, we're going to have to expect to have different types of individuals on there. And therefore, the board has to be more flexible on when they're meeting and those sorts of things, maybe not as many in person. So I think you've touched on some really good points. But I want to say we've come to the end of our conversation, and I want to thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to meet you. I think we've met a few times now, but I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure. I hope it helps.
It will do. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.